There is one other mechanism that's used for determining which server-side control actually initiated a post request. And this is the event target field, and it has a corresponding event argument field. And these are another pair of hidden input elements, much like the view state hidden input element. But I want to be clear about how these are used and when they're used. They're not used for standard postbacks with elements, input elements. So like a button control or an image button, these always render as input elements of type button or image, which will have their values sent back as part of the post intrinsically. So we can identify which control issued that post request. However, there are some controls that can generate post requests, postbacks, which are not traditional postback elements. For example, the change notification that we just looked at in the drop-down list, if you enable auto postback to be true, that will initiate a postback whenever you change it on the client side. And there will be nothing sent in the post body to indicate that the drop-down list was the entity which issued the postback. Similarly, a link button, which is an example of just an anchor tag in the client, but it's got some JavaScript to initiate a postback as well. That also will not, by default, alter the postback. So there would be no way for ASP.NET to know that the anchor tag was the thing that initiated the postback. So that's why there are these two other fields, the event target field, as we'll see, and the event argument field for storing parameters. And the event target field will simply store the identifier of the control that issued the event. So if you have a link button, the identifier will be stored there. Now let's go ahead and just walk through this. I want to make sure everyone's clear on why we need these supplemental fields. So let's go ahead and create a new web form to do some testing. And let's call this event target. And what I'm going to do is start off by designing a form with just a pair of traditional buttons on it. So standard server-side buttons that render as input type equals button elements on the client. And as I mentioned, these are not necessary. These will already send back their identifier when a postback is made, so we don't need to use that hidden field. Let me turn off view state on my label so it doesn't retain state across postbacks, and let me set the text of each of these buttons to 1 and 2 so we can identify them. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to add a handler for each of these button controls. So there's the first button click event, and here's the second button click event. And inside of the handler, I'm going to set the text of the label I put in below there just to a message. So you pressed button 1, for example. And down below we'll do the same thing, except we'll indicate button 2. Okay, so that's the idea. Let's go ahead and run this. And what I want to do is set up a trace so we can see the request going back and forth. So I'll bring up Fiddler here, and let's use our trick of putting a dot after localhost so that the traffic is captured. Okay, let's go ahead and press on button 1 now. So I got my message as expected, and here's the request in Fiddler. Let's bring up the raw request and response. And we can see how ASP.NET could identify that button 1 was the control that was pressed, because if you look, let's scroll in here. If you look at the post body, you'll see down here that button 1 was sent back with its value. And notice button 2 is not in the post body. So this is just the way HTML works and how post requests are generated from a page. And if you look at the source for the page here, you'll see those two buttons were rendered as input elements with type set to submit. And the value was just propagated back as part of the post body. So it's very easy to identify which control issued the post back when you're dealing with standard input elements. So here's an example of button 2 being used to send back the post request. Okay, so nothing special is required there. ASP.NET can handle that. Easy to identify which controls. So let's take an example of controls that do not, let's add an example of controls that do not intrinsically send back post body data so that we could use that to identify which control issued the request. So one example of those that type of control is the link button, and let's just say link button 3 here. And I'm going to go ahead and add a handler for that and print the same message we did before, except let's call it link button 3. And then let me add one more control that will require similar additions to identify. Whoops, let me get it in the right place. So let's put a list box in. I could also put a drop-down list in. And let's go ahead and enable the auto post back so that whenever the user changes the selection of an item, the currently selected item, it will issue a new post back. And then I'm going to add some items here. So item 1, item 2, and item 3. Okay, and then we're going to add a handler for the change notification event of this list box just by double-clicking it. And I'm going to say here, you, instead of pressed, selected a new list box item. Okay, so that should be good. Let's go ahead and just try running it so we can see the behavior. So now my buttons still work as expected, but now also I have this link button, which we know renders as an anchor tag, but it has a little bit of extra JavaScript to initiate a post back. And my change notification is not doing what I expected. Let's go check that guy. So we selected a new list box item. Post back is going back. Okay, everything looks okay. Let's just try that one more time. So try selecting an item in the list box. Good. Okay, so there's the selected item in the list box. There's the link button, and there are the button 1 and 2. So let's put a trace on this thing. So go up and put our dot in here. And let's go ahead and click on a list box item and see what the traffic looked like for that last request. And scroll down here and notice the event target. Let's zoom in here. The hidden event target field, which you see right here, was set to list box 1. So that was the identifier of the control that issued the postback. And you can see how that postback was issued. If you look at the source code for the page, scroll down here, here's the list box. It turned into a select element. And the onChange event handler was wired up to a client-side JavaScript event handler, which initiated the postback by calling this helper function doPostback. So that's sort of a out-of-band postback technique. And notice the same thing happens up above here. The anchor tag, the link button, is also going to initiate the doPostback by invoking that JavaScript function. So that's why we need the assistance. Let's go ahead and try the link button example just to make sure we see something very similar. And indeed we do. So this time the link button was the item that was placed in the event target field. Okay, so those two hidden fields are used whenever you use any of these controls that generate a postback but are not traditional postback input elements in HTML.